5 masterpieces of European painting have been brought together here under the overall title Adoration. They're from different countries, different centuries, but they all have one thing in common, these 5 pictures. They were all painted with the express purpose of showing us someone who is to be revered or adored, or at least looked up to as infinitely more important than we are. We are simply the privileged onlookers, and we better know our place. That is the message. These 5 paintings are Jan van Eyck's Madonna with the Chancellor Rollin, which hangs in the Louvre Museum, Paris; Piero della Francesca's The Resurrection, still in the town where it was painted, Borgo San Sepolcro in Italy; Botticelli's The Birth of Venus in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence; Rigaud's portrait of King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, another picture in the Louvre Museum, Paris; and finally Tiepolo's The Triumph of Virtue, which is now in the Norton Simon Museum, Pasadena, California. The purpose of collecting these 5 paintings together in one group is to be able to compare how 5 very great artists have tackled a far from easy task, which is to convey tremendous reverence without actually seeming to grovel. Now, traditionally, the most natural object of reverence for any Western artist has, of course, been Jesus Christ, or else someone else central to the Christian faith, such as preeminently the mother of Christ, Mary. And in the earliest of these 5 paintings, the Van Eyck, the person being adored is the Virgin Mary, shown, as she very often is, with the infant Christ. These are the figures we're supposed to be adoring, except that in this instance there's another figure in the painting doing the adoring for us, or so it would seem. And he's the man who actually commissioned the picture. He commissioned it and he's got himself into the painting. So it's an open question as to whether he's there to pay his respects to the Madonna and Child, or actually to receive our respects.
This placid, but as we'll see, extraordinary scene, showing a civil servant, Nicolas Rollin, firmly planted in the company of the Queen of Heaven, was painted by Jan van Eyck in 1434. Van Eyck was a Burgundian, and Burgundy then comprised not only the fabulously rich wine-growing province of France, but much of modern Belgium and Holland. It included internationally famous centres of trade and industry like Brussels, Ghent, and Bruges, which was larger than London and more prosperous than Paris. Its Duke, Philip the Good, was the wealthiest ruler in Europe. He was also a generous patron of writers, as this illumination shows, and artists. He employed Jan van Eyck, paid him well, and valued his intelligence enough to send him on a number of diplomatic errands. So Jan was close to the mood and interests of the most glamorous court in the West, an educated and traveled man, an intellectual as well as a painter. The Duke's right-hand man in all affairs of state was his chancellor, Nicolas Rollin. Rollin was 58 when Jan brought him here, calculating, tough, very wealthy, loathed by those jealous of his influence, as intent on the courtly wheeling and dealing of the moment as on getting an equivalent position in the court of eternity, the errand which brings him here. But where is he? Has she, as in a vision, come down to him? Or has he, as in a meditation, gone up to her? They're in an airy but meticulously solid hall of state, and it is surely hers. Her throne is permanent, of inlaid marble. His prie-dieu is portable, carried with him in his thoughts. And the artist has anyway made it clear that such a room couldn't possibly have existed on Earth. That quadrifoil decoration at the base of the column is Gothic. But the arches springing from the top of the column are rounded, Romanesque, an earlier style. It's topsy-turvy. It's a clue to the sophisticated observer to adjust his eyes to the court of heaven. And it's very likely that while Jan was painting this scene, that he had one specific aspect of heaven in mind, the New Jerusalem, as described in the Bible in the Revelation of St. John the Divine. There are tiny biblical scenes in the capitals. But the room is otherwise quite secular in its architecture. John wrote of the city, "I saw no temple therein." And John described it as having a wall great and high, and there it is, a battlemented parapet beyond a garden planted with the red roses of Christ's blood and the white lilies of the Virgin's purity. Most unusually, both mother and child are shown with the attributes of political power. She is being crowned. He holds an orb. And his expression, as he blesses Rollin, has a somewhat unchildlike, "it's up to you" expression. In 1434, the Duke of Burgundy was eager to lead a crusade to free the earthly Jerusalem from the infidel, and thus extend the kingdom of Christ on earth. And it would be Rollin's job to organize Burgundy as part of this. So, prompted by the eager, imperial little boy, he's thinking of the enhanced chance of his getting up here permanently that a successful crusade would bring. In all this, Jan must have been following his patron's instructions, but the background of the painting was his. And the view beyond the Holy Trinity of arches, one of the most amazing ever painted, was his view of worship and salvation. Far below the parapet, the river divides a fortified city on the right from its suburb on the left. They're connected by a bridge defended by a tower. Tiny people, minuscule but sufficient nudges of the finest of brushes, cross the bridge. And more of them appear in the streets and square of the suburb. This, behind the brooding, very much of this world presence of Rollin, has only one church, perfectly practical, given the low density of the housing. A city, behind the Virgin, is in total contrast. The houses are swamped by churches. Thanks to the minute precision of Jan's brush, you can count 10 of them, culminating in the vast cathedral, though it's less than an inch high, next to her shoulder. In an earlier picture, Jan had shown the Virgin filling a church like a holy giantess, because she was as necessary to the efficacy of prayer as her son was to salvation. So the city is Jan's Virginopolis, his personal homage to the girl deity who must fill men's prayers before they can rise to heaven. Meanwhile, the boats discharge at the quayside or ply across the river. Such unnatural clarity in the description of individual things had something in common with the detailed profusion that was characteristic of Burgundian culture as a whole, from poems and chronicles to banquets and processions. And it also had the backing of a philosophy which taught that only individual objects were knowable. Generalizations and concepts, linking them into categories, might be true, but couldn't be proved. So the surest way of praising God aright was to reproduce, with the most loving exactitude, the objects he had created or enabled man to make. And this brings us to the two anonymous men at the painting's center. They look a bit like dwarfs, but it's clear that the standing man is of normal height because he's exactly the same height as the protective parapet. Standing up against the wall, he can't see the view. Perhaps he's actually blind. He seems quite young, yet he's holding a stick. He appears to be listening to his companion, who's leaning well forward to look down at the river. It can't be an accident that the exact center of this scrupulously thought-out work lies between the clump of virgin lilies and these unimpressive little figures. What's more, though our interest across the painting depends on the interplay between the massive, intent presence of Rollin and the Virgin and Child, our interest up into the picture is rushed up the unbroken row of tiles towards them. Is it too far-fetched to interpret the one who leans over the battlements of the New Jerusalem in order to see God's creation with all the freshness imparted to it by the Creator as the painter, and the one who can't see as representing those of us who must rely on an artist's eye to imagine both heaven and earth as they should be seen?
The Van Eyck was painted for the Royal Court of Burgundy in 1434. The next picture was painted only about 25 years later, not for a royal court, but for the main civic building of a smallish Italian town on the edge of Tuscany. The artist was a local man, Piero della Francesca, and the object of adoration is once again Jesus Christ. Only this time it's Christ as the center of the triumphant miracle of Christianity, the resurrection.
The little town of Borgo San Sepolcro was Piero della Francesca's hometown. Here he was born somewhere around 1415, and here he died in 1492. The Palazzo dei Conservatori, the central civic building, the one that Piero knew, it's still there, and now it's the Museo Civico and houses the local art gallery. And in it, still several paintings by the town's greatest son, Piero della Francesca. Piero's resurrection has always been here, even though it was once covered with whitewash. Anyway, it has suffered damage through the centuries, although the total impact is still breathtaking. The theme of the resurrection, to put it mildly, was challenging to the point of being daunting, but for the citizens of San Sepolcro, a town named after the Holy Sepulchre, it must have been irresistible, and it was they, presumably, who commissioned Piero della Francesca to paint it. Piero originally set his composition within a simulated architectural frame, and that framework is the most damaged bit, and in part rather inefficiently restored, but it is important. For one thing, its perspective makes it quite clear that we are meant to be looking up at the picture from below, as does the drawing of the four figures sprawled in front of the sepulchre, so that it's always been meant to be seen from below as now. That sets what's happening in the picture at a remove, in a different space, and perhaps in a different scheme of things, a different order of reality, as a window doesn't, but a stage, of course, can. And what is going on is very much of a different order of reality. It's the greatest, most triumphant miracle of all Christianity. Christ rises from the dead. It's the proof that death is not the end. Nearest to us are the four guards in the disarray of sleep. They are skewed in discomfort, as soldiers from time immemorial tend to be when asleep when they're supposed not to be. The second from the left, the one with his head tilted back, that's said to be a self-portrait of Piero, and not impossibly. Then the one clutching a spear or lance that may remind you of the weapon that pierced Christ's side 2 days before. On the right, the fourth, and how he's propped up I'm not quite clear, but he seems to me to be on the point of pulling himself up, but still disbelieving in his sleep. What a flicker of his opening eyes have told him is going on above. The guards are solidly drawn in strongish colour, and they form a sort of broken calyx, collapsed outwards. From its centre, onto the rim of the open sarcophagus, Christ resurrects. Solid, his torso firm as ivory, marked by the lance wound, but immaculate of trace of scourge or of thorns. And the shroud has become a ceremonial drapery, as if a classical toga, but of a very pale, very delicate rose pink. Christ stands four square, his left foot raised on the sarcophagus edge, a banner in his right hand, the head looking out over you, yet into you. Piero wasn't the first to use this exact pose. The idea could have come, for example, from the Sienese altarpiece that he'd have known in a local church, though it's now in this museum. In style, though, that would have been very archaic to Piero's Florentine-trained eyes. From about the same time as Piero's, there comes a little painting by Mantegna. And yet, that usually most austere of painters, Mantegna, he seems almost to have cocooned Christ's body in fluffy angel's wings, a memory perhaps of the traditional device of the mandola, but it's a device that Piero could achieve his effects without. Piero's vision in its brooding intensity, though, does seem to echo other older traditions, and not just in the style of the hair, the beard, but in the authority of those dark eyes, that almost blank yet loaded stare from the whites of the eyes under the clear curve of the upper lids. This is the Christ who, crucified, descended into hell, and there broke the locks of hell and released the tormented souls within. The risen Christ, awakening, but still stunned, one who has seen everything, has died, yet has survived. And something of this is in the face of Christ as the Byzantine mosaicists saw him, huge and presiding, the Pantocrator in judgment presiding from the gold heavens of great basilicas, like Santa Sophia at Istanbul. Yet the body of Piero's Christ is more that of a Hellenistic Greek god, as if to incorporate in the Christian god all superseded pagan deities. The stance, that's the immemorial one of the triumphant victor, but here the defeated enemy on which that foot is so solidly planted isn't human or animal, but the grave, death itself vanquished. And in the world over which Christ presides here, time has lost its tyranny. The sleeping guards, they're in Roman armor. The landscape rising beyond is that of the lower slopes of the Apennines, as it was in the 15th century, as it can be today. But magically, the bare trees of winter on the left yield to the rebirth of spring on the right. This is in no way a comfortable picture. I sense no compassion in that gaze, rather an affirmation of endurance, of ultimate survival. Certainly no promise of bland bliss. And yet, it's an immensely exalting image. Piero's resurrection lifts us too. Something of this is due to Piero's use of perspective. There's a dual viewing point. The soldiers, the sepulchre, as we've noted, they're seen from below, but Christ is seen from a higher point, level with his own body. And so his body becomes even more the upright, from which all else depends. Piero was arch-theorist and arch-technician of the newly discovered mathematics of perspective. He wrote books about them. And this painting is structured with almost architectural logic and precision. It's as solid as the facade of a great church. But Piero was also obsessed with light and with the forms that the limpid Italian light begets on glowing colour, clear and all but shadowless. And it was in all these terms that he saw the great themes of Christianity, never more perfectly, more awesomely than in this affirmation of the risen Christ, this fusion of abstract design with the physical world, where the supernatural informs the natural with such incontrovertible majesty.
Now another Italian picture, still in the 15th century and about 25 years on. The artist was a Florentine painter, Sandro Botticelli, and this was a private commission for a private house, or rather a palace. Official pictures, or public pictures at this time, more or less had to be on religious themes. But in this case, there was no need for that kind of piety, and the theme is frankly pagan, from Greek mythology. The object of adoration is the goddess of love, and the painting is that great favourite, The Birth of Venus.
At a rough count, the equivalent of the entire adult population of the United States has come here since the end of the Second World War to pay homage to one painting above all others. Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. I can't help feeling that a person who has never, at some time in his life, fallen in love with this picture has missed one of the overwhelming experiences which works of art can offer. As for me, I fell in love with it when I was 17, the first time I came here, and if anything, I love it more than ever. But coming to it afresh after all those coffee table books and postcard reproductions and images on T-shirts, the first surprise is how very large it is, because reproductions tend to reduce everything to a uniform size. In fact, the picture is nearly 10 foot across and Venus is virtually life-size. The second surprise is, for a picture which is, after all, among the most famous in the world, how very private it is and very mysterious. It's a bewitching painting. The picture illustrates an ancient Greek myth that Venus, or Aphrodite, was born from the foam of the sea. Botticelli shows her riding naked on a scallop shell, which is her own symbol, in Latin Venera, the Venus shell, and she is being blown gently towards the shore amid a cascade of pink roses by two entwined figures who represent the winds. As she approaches the world of men, Venus already grows modest of her beauty and her nakedness, and her attendant, who's decked out in garlands and more pink roses, waits for the goddess, holding out a gown to throw about her as she steps ashore. Now, in 15th century Italy, most commissions of this size were for devotional pictures destined for churches. commission large pictures on pagan themes was novel in Florence. Botticelli's Primavera had been among the earliest. Now, this was not a case of lip-smacking hedonism bursting out when a picture was intended for a private dwelling rather than a church. It reflected a new and distinctly sober interest among educated Florentines in the classical world of Greece and Rome, the Renaissance as we know it. No longer was the ancient world of myth viewed as pagan, but as a golden age in which our own civilization was born. An enlightened young Florentine, like Pier Francesco de' Medici, who commissioned the Primavera and the Birth of Venus, would have been thoroughly schooled in Greek myth and Greek philosophy, particularly that of Plato. Venus was not simply a pagan love goddess, she embodied much that the Renaissance stood for, sailing into the lives of men as a kind of savior. She was truth, she was humanity, she was divine beauty revealed. Now, I very much doubt if Botticelli had more than the skimpiest understanding of the writings of any Greek philosophers, Plato or any other. So what did he do? Well, I think you have to imagine a group of Cambridge philosophers of our own day wanting to commission a painter of our time to illustrate, let's say, the soliloquies of Wittgenstein. What a painter would do, if he had any sense, would be to brush up a few basic facts on Wittgenstein, grab the money, and go off and do what he wanted to do, what Wittgenstein meant to him. And this, I suspect, is precisely what Botticelli did with this painting. There's no attempt to describe the world of antiquity. What Botticelli does is to evoke the enchantment which the classical world must have held for those discovering it for the first time. It unlocks his imagination. All around Botticelli, painters in Florence were discovering how to copy nature. They went out and examined animals and plants. They studied human anatomy. They worked out mathematical laws of perspective. The Renaissance spirit fed on facts, on discovery. Copernicus was already born, so was Luther. Columbus was already a sea captain. And yet, Botticelli turned his back on this brave new world. He preferred to be enchanted by nature rather than to measure it. Leonardo da Vinci, his contemporary, grumbled that Botticelli made very dull landscapes. And one can see what he means. You could hardly go for a walk here. The soil is so unreal, the attendant's feet scarcely touch it. These are not real waves. And Venus herself. Kenneth Clark has pointed out that she is quite off balance. Her weight could never be supported on this foot. She would fall down if she were real. She is an antique statue pretending to be alive. Yet she is alive. How very alive. Maybe there was a model in Florence who looked like this, and maybe Botticelli was in love with her. There's a legend, largely unfounded, that she is Simonetta, the beautiful mistress of another of the Medicis, Giuliano. I doubt it. To me, she seems like a personification of beauty, Botticelli's ideal, rather than a real person. And she recurs over and over again in his paintings. She is the tender young Madonna, painted by assistants, but the drawing is unmistakably Botticelli's. She is melancholic, again, as the Madonna. She is mischievous, as Flora in the Primavera. And she's stern in the painting of Venus and Mars. In The Birth of Venus, she manages to possess all these characteristics and to be even more beautiful. She seems closest here to Botticelli's ideal. In fact, everything in the painting enshrines her beauty. The two figures of the winds waft her to the shore, but their breath is made visible so that it seems to caress her skin and play with her golden hair. Not just a figure of speech either. Botticelli has used gold paint. The attendant figure on the shore holds a gown that billows out in the same breeze. What Botticelli has done is to abstract from his observations of the living world a language of rhythmic patterns, like the fluttering of garments, or of hair, or the movement of waves. And it's this most delicate sensitivity to pattern which enables him in so much of his work to choreograph a story, to tell it in the form of a ballet. Now, this genius of Botticelli remained unappreciated while lifelike reality was the ideal of art. But in this present century, such an ideal has largely collapsed, and other values have come to the fore. In particular, the value placed on truth to experience, to how an artist feels. It may sound strange to look upon Botticelli as a precursor of modernism. Nonetheless, it seems to me one of the exciting things about the art of our century that it should enable us to enjoy even so famous a painting as this one with refreshed eyes.
An obvious subject for adoration is monarchy. The difference is that whereas gods and goddesses have to be recreated by the artist out of his own imagination, a king is very much there in the flesh. And no one was more dominantly there in the flesh than King Louis XIV, the man who ruled France for 71 years, the longest reigning monarch in Europe. Here he is in 1681, 3/4 of the way through that reign.
God had sufficiently gifted him to enable him to be a good king, perhaps even a tolerably great one. These prophetic words were written by Saint-Simon when he arrived at the court of Versailles in 1691, just 10 years before this portrait of Louis XIV was painted by Rigaud. Saint-Simon was wary of the king and hardly lavish in his praise. Yet this pronouncement seems heartfelt enough. And in the 18th century, Voltaire was to write, "Nature herself seemed to excel in producing men of the highest rank in all the arts in France, and in bringing together at the court of Versailles the most handsome and the best favored men and women ever to grace a court." Above all his courtiers, Louis rose supreme by grace of his figure and the majestic nobility of his countenance. The sound of his voice, at once dignified and charming, won the hearts of those whom his presence had intimidated. His bearing was such as befitted himself and his rank alone, and would have been ridiculous in any other. The awe which he inspired in those who spoke with him secretly flattered the consciousness of his own superiority. The old officer who became confused and faltered in his speech when asking a favor, finally breaking off with, "Sire, I have never trembled thus before your enemies," had no difficulty in obtaining what he asked. Such sentiments are impossible today, and merely listening to them may make people angry. And yet we still think of the age of Louis XIV as one of the high peaks of European civilization, and we're not likely to forget the experience of wandering through the rooms and gardens of Louis's most outstanding creation, Versailles. By 1682, there were 36,000 workmen at Versailles. To his grandson, Philip V of Spain, Louis remarked, "There are few more innocent amusements than hunting and the pleasures of a country house, provided one does not spend too much on it." To his great-grandson, who was to become Louis XV, he confessed that he had spent too much on Versailles, a sentiment with which the revolutionary mobs were to be in total agreement. Today, in this age of architectural shame, we must be grateful for every penny he lavished on his beloved palace and its gardens. Here he is, as painted by Rigaud, in his coronation robes. He is 62 years old, and he has been King of France for 57 years. He has another 14 to go. This phenomenon easily dominates the emblems of royalty grouped discreetly to his right: the scepter, the crown, and the hand of justice. The order of the Saint-Esprit round his neck is no more prominent than the figure of justice with the sword and scales on the base of the column. Any amusement provoked by the ridiculous padded breeches and high-heeled shoes is instantly quelled by the cynicism of that gaze. Here is a man who knew exactly what his courtiers thought of him because he opened their letters to find out. In this confrontation between the painter and his model, it is the model who wins. So great a sitter would douse any idiosyncrasies that Rigaud might have thought of introducing. And for a court painter, which is what he was, Rigaud was capable of very independent tastes. Many of his less overpowering wigged and armoured sitters are adorned with surprising bursts of drapery in glorious colours of hyacinth, scarlet, and bronze. And into the framework of his airtight portrait compositions comes the heavy ripple of drapery and curtain, agitated by a theatrical tempest somewhere off stage. The painter, Rigaud, was not only a public servant who sensed the drama of public occasions, he was a connoisseur both of people and of pictures, probably in that order. One of the few facts we know about him is that he owned 8 works by Van Dyck and 7 by Rembrandt. And this monumental, quintessential, and indeed archetypal portrait of Louis XIV is in fact an adaptation of another portrait of another king, Van Dyck's Charles I of England. With rather more subtle flattery, Van Dyck has shown the tiny and sensitive Charles I as just another English country gentleman, although his pearl earrings and satin doublet hinted his almost feminine fastidiousness. Yet Van Dyck succeeds in conveying nonchalance, an aristocratic English quality not much prized by the French, who preferred precision. If Charles I might be mistaken by the uninitiated for a gentleman out hunting, Louis XIV, who in fact did hunt twice a week, is nothing less than an anointed monarch. We do not need any symbols to explain this to us, and indeed there is something unnecessary about all those lilies of France on the mantle and the cushion. Instead of symbolism, Rigaud has rightly given us profusion. That vast, heavy curve of ermine, those great tassels, that slow-moving curtain in the king's favourite colour, brown. This strong but ageing man, striking a pose for his clever court painter, knows that his subjects are sick and tired of him. The news of his death in 1715 was to be greeted with relief at Versailles and with joy in Paris. And when Rigaud set to, in 1730, to paint the new anointed monarch, Louis XV, he proceeded with that briskness and energy that is said to have characterized the end of an era at Versailles. Draperies flutter, coronation robes swing aside, gilded ropes are slung round columns. Yet the effect is less, particularly when we return to Louis XIV. Patient, knowing, haughty and impassive, the king, for I think we must acknowledge that he is the king, gazes down at us. Like most portraits of kings, and more than most, it is an icon. That is to say, a symbolic, almost sacred image. If you like, you could say that the artist has put a subject on a pedestal. But the fact that Rigaud has somehow preserved his own dignity along with that of the king is a considerable achievement. It is this sense that powers are being held in reserve by both artist and subject that underlines the more obvious majesty of this particular portrait.
One way of ensuring that we look up to someone is to make us physically look up. In other words, to paint the subject high on a wall, or better still, on a ceiling. The 18th century painter Tiepolo from Venice was a master at this way of elevating his subject. He would paint a ceiling as though it was the sky itself, with gods and goddesses and angels floating there for us all to admire. No question whatever of solemnity anymore. Tiepolo's goddesses are simply objects of desire. In fact, they are among our very first pin-ups.
This painting is a wonderful absurdity. And to appreciate the full wonder of it, as well as the full absurdity, you really have to imagine that you're standing in a magnificent palace in Venice and gazing up at it, high above you on the ceiling. Now, the artist was Giambattista Tiepolo, who came from Venice, and he painted it in the 1740s. And the reason why Tiepolo was the most sought-after painter of his day was a gift he had for decorating the mansions of the rich with the most gorgeous fairy tales like this one. These fairy tales reflected his patron's taste for pleasure and for seeking flight from humdrum realities on earth. Not a promising area for a serious artist, you might think. But my goodness, how miraculously he did it. Tiepolo offered his patrons a roof of boundless space, and that space filled Tiepolo's own imagination like a sail. His figures command the sky as naturally as the patrons themselves commanded the affairs of men on earth. Here above their heads was a heavenly mirror of their own worldly authority. This particular extravaganza is called The Triumph of Virtue and Nobility over Ignorance. An excessively heavy title for so buoyant a picture, you may say. The Triumph of Pleasure would have been more apt, and certainly this must have been the message to those who gazed up at it on the ceiling of the Palazzo Manin in Venice. Well, the picture was long ago removed from there, and today it hangs rather appropriately in a museum created by one of the wealthiest art collectors of our own day, Mr. Norton Simon, in Pasadena, California. I can't help feeling that only a Venetian could have created so airy a fantasy and brought it off successfully. Because after all, Venice itself is a city which doesn't seem to be earthed. It's built on water, and what earth there is insubstantial. We love Venice just as I love Tiepolo, precisely because it doesn't seem to be entirely anchored to this world. And in Tiepolo's day, it was doubly insubstantial because the Venetian Republic was on its last legs. Within 50 years, Napoleon would sweep it away. Is it so surprising, then, that the Venetian imagination should look away from reality and have its head in the clouds? Indeed, clouds are the only support the heavens can provide for these figures. By an outrageous bluff, virtue and nobility defy gravity with only one pair of feeble wings and a few billowing robes between them. Even the figure of ignorance falling is scarcely tumbling to earth with a crash, but merely toppled as if she's slipped momentarily on a cloud. In fact, if you weren't told, you would be unlikely to see her as representing anything bad at all. She wears fine robes. She reclines as fetchingly as virtue and nobility, with a bare foot and bare breasts. And she crooks her fingers no less fetchingly. So, ignorance, virtue, nobility, where is the meaning behind these high-sounding moral labels? And aren't they another bluff? I think so. With Tiepolo, moral considerations hardly come into it. He's not a moralist. He's an entertainer. He provides wit and delight. This is luxurious stagecraft, theatre, the theatre of the sky. And like most theatre, the credibility of the performance depends on our not being too close. It helps to know the extravagant context it was designed for, like the residence at Würzburg in Germany. This light, almost frivolous architecture in the Rococo style is incomplete, it seems to me, without the paintings of Tiepolo and the music of his Venetian contemporary, Vivaldi. This flamboyant vision of Olympus is on the ceiling of the grand staircase. Think of climbing up to bed under such a canopy of glory. No wonder the aristocracy of Europe couldn't grasp that their rule might ever end. What Tiepolo is habitually glorifying is love, or rather women as objects of love or incarnations of love. They're all goddesses of love in one guise or another. It doesn't matter what they're called. This most glorious of them is Venus herself, in another ceiling painting from a palace in Venice, and now in the National Gallery, London. What a goddess for a noble family of a dying republic to dream about. Tiepolo might have done rather well in Hollywood if he'd lived 200 years later. And the fact that here in Pasadena we're within a few miles of Hollywood is again rather appropriate, because Tiepolo's goddesses have as little to do with daily life as film stars of vintage Hollywood. Their realm is glamour, and glamour is something that is required to be set above us, just as Tiepolo's goddesses are set literally above us. They are stars set among the stars, except that for Tiepolo it is never night, and the radiance of full sunlight always shines upon them. The figure of virtue even wears a sun emblazoned on her breast, a sun with the face of a child. A ridiculous convention when you come to think of it. But then you aren't supposed to think of it. You accept such conventions as show business, just as you accept that most absurd of all conventions, angelic cherubs known as putti, cavorting round the heavens as if the sky were their playground, sometimes playing suggestively beneath billowing skirts, sometimes stumbling in tears against a nasty black cloud, sometimes naughtily flying away out of the picture altogether. No, we're not supposed to think rationally about these absurdities, but to enjoy them as moviegoers used to enjoy Shirley Temple. And to enjoy, too, the marvelous orchestration of colours which Tiepolo achieves. Daring colours, a border of pink on a golden robe, next to darker pink set against flaming scarlet. What couturier would have dared to put that lot together? Then, by contrast to these colours in full sunlight, the sombre tones of the falling figure of ignorance, her dusky skin next to deep indigo and russet, set against a spray of scarlet flowers. Dark flesh against white cloud, pale against dark. Tiepolo was a master at all this, just as he was a master draftsman. None of these absurd conventions would carry conviction unless each figure, each limb and gesture were brilliantly drawn, which they are. Sophia Loren and Elizabeth Taylor could not look more lifelike on the screen or more desirable than these goddesses who patrol the sensuous horizons of our dreams.
In Tiepolo, an aristocratic society saw its dreams of glamour and of immortality mirrored in the heavens. Towards the end of his life, Tiepolo was summoned to Madrid to carry out the last of his commissions for European royalty, for the King of Spain. And here in Spain, Tiepolo died in 1770 at the age of 74. Within a few decades, many of the noble families he'd worked for saw those dreams of immortality come tumbling down. The French Revolution sent shockwaves across Europe which sank the Venetian Republic and sent the Spanish royal family and many others into exile. A young Spaniard who must have seen Tiepolo's work in Madrid, and may even have met him, was Goya. His early paintings echo Tiepolo's fairy tale world, but not for long. Goya's era was a time of revolution, and by the time he came to paint the walls of his own house, it wasn't love goddesses in the sky he chose to depict. It was ruffians sinking in the mud, fighting a sordid battle, as though after them the human race would be extinguished, like the dinosaurs. Tiepolo's paintings are the end of a mighty tradition of Italian painting. But having taken to the air, there was really no further for it to go, just as there was no further to go for the society he worked for. Tiepolo spun glamorous fairy tales for a doomed aristocracy. And yet, so delectably did he spin them that their appeal, at least for me, has far outlived the society he served.